France finds itself navigating a turbulent period of political and economic upheaval, compounded by a significant shift in its relationships with African nations. The political landscape within France is fraught, as evidenced by the collapse of Prime Minister Michel Barnier's government in December 2024 after a no-confidence vote in the National Assembly. But the challenges extend far beyond French borders, as the country's long-standing influence in Africa is being rapidly dismantled. In a series of decisive moves, several African nations have opted to end military agreements with France and demanded the withdrawal of French troops. Ivory Coast became the latest to join this wave, announcing at the end of December 2024 that French forces would begin their withdrawal in January 2025. President Alassane Ouattara framed the decision as a reflection of the progress made in modernising the Ivorian armed forces, asserting the nation's capability to manage its security independently. This announcement followed similar steps taken by Mali, Burkina Faso, Niger, Senegal, and Chad, signalling a regional trend of severing ties with the former colonial power. Senegal, for example, took a firm stance in December 2024 when Prime Minister Bassirou Diomaye announced plans to close all foreign military bases, including those operated by France. This decision was fueled by growing public sentiment, advocating for national sovereignty and an end to foreign military influence. Similarly, Chad made headlines in November 2024 by terminating its defence cooperation agreement with France, a bold move for a nation historically regarded as a cornerstone of French counter-terrorism efforts in the Sahel. France began withdrawing its forces from Chad the following month, marking a turning point in their bilateral relations. Niger's situation unfolded earlier, following a coup in July 2023. The new leadership promptly suspended military agreements with France, citing strong opposition to the French presence. By September 2023, France had announced its plans to withdraw troops and diplomatic staff, completing the pullout by year's end. Burkina Faso followed a similar trajectory. The breakdown of relations between France and Mali reached a critical juncture when Mali's transitional government made the controversial decision to invite the Russian Wagner Group for security assistance. This choice caused a sharp escalation in tensions with France, culminating in February 2022, when France announced the withdrawal of its troops. This decision ended nearly a decade of French military deployment in the Sahel, which had been aimed at combating Islamist insurgencies. For Mali, this marked a bold pivot away from reliance on French military support and highlighted a broader movement among African nations to re-evaluate their ties with former colonial powers, seeking greater independence and self-determination in matters of security and governance. This shift is part of a larger story that stretches back through centuries of French involvement in Africa, a history shaped by complex and often exploitative interactions. To understand this dynamic, we need to go back to the origins of French engagement on the continent. In the early days, France established trading posts along the coasts of Senegal, Saint Louis, Gorée Island, and the Gulf of Guinea. These outposts were ostensibly set up to trade goods like gold and ivory, but they quickly became entangled in the transatlantic slave trade. French traders used a combination of coercion, manipulative treaties, and outright violence to pressure local leaders into participating in the trade. The consequences were devastating. Entire communities were uprooted, traditional societies dismantled, and countless Africans forcibly deported to the Americas. The relentless pursuit of profit caused an irreparable loss of human capital and created deep social and economic scars that linger to this day. As time went on, French ambitions in Africa grew more aggressive. During the late 19th century, European powers, including France, divided up the continent in a scramble for territory, formalised at the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885. This division paid little attention to the existing cultural, ethnic, or historical boundaries of African societies. France's acquisitions spanned vast regions, including Senegal, Mali, Côte d'Ivoire, Gabon, Chad, and Congo, and were consolidated into two large administrative units. These territorial claims were driven by a desire to expand France's empire and extract Africa's resources, with little regard for the devastating social and cultural consequences for the people who lived there. The arbitrary borders imposed by colonial powers created divisions that have fueled conflicts and instability long after the colonial era ended. Within the territories it controlled, France implemented policies that it claimed were aimed at assimilation. On paper, this concept offered Africans the opportunity to become French by adopting French language and culture. In reality, this policy was highly exclusionary. Only a small elite group, known as the Evolus, was granted limited access to French citizenship, while the majority of Africans remained colonial subjects with no political rights. When full assimilation proved unworkable, France adopted a policy of association, which superficially respected certain local customs while maintaining the colonial power structures firmly in French hands. These policies eroded African cultural identities while offering little in return, using a veneer of inclusivity to mask systemic domination and exploitation. The economic aspect of French colonial rule was equally extractive. Commodities like rubber, cotton, cocoa, groundnuts, gold, uranium, and diamonds were systematically exploited to fuel France's industrial growth with little benefit to African communities. Forced labour systems, such as the corvée, compelled Africans to build infrastructure like railways and administrative buildings under brutal conditions and for little or no pay. Taxation policies further impoverished rural populations, forcing them to become cheap labour to meet colonial financial demands. Entire regions were reshaped to serve the economic interests of France, leaving local populations with little to show for their contributions except hardship and exploitation. This long history of exploitation and domination forms the backdrop for the current wave of African nations seeking to redefine their relationships with France. By rejecting foreign military presence and pursuing greater self-reliance, these nations are not only challenging the legacies of colonialism, but also forging new paths toward a future that prioritises their sovereignty and aspirations. This realignment reflects a broader determination among African countries to break free from old structures and explore partnerships that better align with their vision for the future. If you are still watching this video, it means you love it. Why not take out a second to hit that like button? Let us continue. France's colonial footprint in Africa left a lasting legacy of cultural, economic, and political domination that extended well beyond the formal end of colonial rule. One of the most insidious tools of this influence was the manipulation of education and culture. While French language schools were established across its African colonies, their primary purpose was not to empower local populations, but to create a small elite loyal to France. These institutions sidelined local histories, languages and traditions, perpetuating a narrative of French cultural superiority. Catholic and Protestant missionaries further entrenched this dominance, often dismissing African spiritual practices as primitive, undermining indigenous knowledge systems, and eroding the social cohesion that had sustained communities for generations. The seeds of resistance were planted during the World Wars. African soldiers, such as the Tirailleurs Sénégalais, were conscripted to fight for freedoms in Europe that they themselves were denied at home. These soldiers endured racial discrimination within the French military and returned to inadequate pensions and a lack of recognition for their sacrifices. Yet their experiences abroad exposed them to ideas of democracy and self-determination. Influential figures like Léopold Sédar Senghor from Senegal and Félix Houphouët-Boigny from Côte d'Ivoire returned to their homelands inspired to push for greater autonomy and eventually full independence. The road to independence, however, was anything but straightforward. After World War II, international scrutiny forced France to introduce limited political reforms in its colonies, but these were largely superficial, with real power remaining firmly in French hands. General Charles de Gaulle offered African territories a choice between continued ties to France under the French Community or immediate independence. Guinea, under the leadership of Ahmed Sékou Touré, boldly chose independence, only to face a harsh reprisal. France abruptly withdrew, sabotaging infrastructure and leaving the country to rebuild from scratch. Over time, mounting international pressure compelled France to relinquish formal control, but this did not mean the end of its influence. In the post-colonial era, France developed intricate neocolonial networks, collectively referred to as Francafrique. Through these mechanisms, French officials like Jacques Foccart maintained clandestine relationships with African leaders, often propping up authoritarian regimes that served French strategic and economic interests. Leaders such as Gabon's Omar Bongo and Togo's Gnassingbé Eyadema remained in power with French backing, ensuring a level of stability that primarily benefited French business interests. Economically, France continued to exert dominance through tools like the CFA franc, a currency used by West and Central African nations that remains pegged to the euro. This arrangement forces these countries to deposit a portion of their foreign reserves with the French treasury, effectively limiting their economic sovereignty. French multinational corporations such as Total Energies, Ballor and Orange have maintained a stranglehold on key sectors like oil, logistics and telecommunications, often securing lucrative contracts through opaque deals that bypassed local interests. France's military presence has been another pillar of its influence. Post-independence agreements allowed France to station troops and intervene militarily at will, ostensibly to maintain stability. These interventions often aligned with French strategic interests, from Chad in the 1970s to Ivory Coast in the 2000s and the Sahel more recently. While presented as peacekeeping efforts, these operations frequently shaped local power dynamics in ways that served France. One of the darkest chapters was the Rwandan genocide of 1994, where France faced accusations of supporting the Hutu-led regime both before and during the crisis. The end of the Cold War brought global pressure for democratic reforms, forcing France to publicly endorse human rights and good governance. However, in practice, Paris continued to prioritise relationships with compliant strongmen over grassroots political movements, undermining genuine democratic transitions. This disconnect between rhetoric and action became a focal point of criticism from young Africans, civil society groups, and opposition leaders who began to challenge France's role more openly. In recent years, France's once dominant position in Africa has faced growing challenges. Emerging powers like China, Russia, Turkey, and the United States have provided African nations with alternative sources of investment, trade, and military support. This diversification has eroded the exclusivity France once enjoyed, forcing it to confront a new reality in which its influence is increasingly contested. Youth-driven movements and Pan-African advocates are stepping up their demands to overhaul or abolish the CFA franc system, which they see as a glaring relic of colonial domination that continues to stifle economic freedom. These movements argue that the system, which keeps monetary policies of West and Central African nations tied to France, perpetuates dependency and blocks the path to full sovereignty. As calls for financial autonomy grow louder, the continent is also witnessing a significant shift in partnerships, with China emerging as a major player and in many cases replacing France's historical dominance. Over the last 2 decades, China has dramatically increased its presence in Africa, offering an alternative approach to engagement. Unlike former colonial powers, Beijing positions its involvement as a win-win collaboration, emphasizing respect for sovereignty and alignment with Africa's development priorities. Although rooted in Cold War-era solidarity, this relationship gained momentum in the early 2000s, driven by China's rapid economic growth and Africa's urgent need for infrastructure development. Under the Forum on China-Africa Cooperation, FOCAC, established in 2000, trade between the two regions has grown from a modest $10 billion to over $200 billion by 2022. China's approach is built on strategic investments and large-scale infrastructure projects that address pressing local needs. Through concessional loans, public-private partnerships, and direct investments, Beijing has become one of Africa's top investors. Central to this collaboration is the Belt and Road Initiative, BRI, launched in 2013. Over 50 African countries have signed onto BRI projects targeting vital sectors like transportation, energy, telecommunications, and industrial development. The results have been transformative. In East Africa, the Addis Ababa-Djibouti Railway, completed in 2016 at a cost of $3.4 billion, slashed travel time between the two cities from days to mere hours, significantly boosting Ethiopia's coffee and textile exports. Similarly, Kenya's $3.2 billion Mombasa-Nairobi standard gauge railway has reduced freight costs by 35% and created tens of thousands of jobs. Energy projects too illustrate China's impact. Uganda's 600-megawatt Karuma hydroelectric power station, constructed by Sinohydro, promises to expand the country's electrification rate, while Ethiopia's Adama wind farm, funded and built by Chinese firms, contributes significantly to the national grid and aligns with the country's green economy strategy. Meanwhile, telecommunications giants like Huawei and ZTE have rolled out fibre optic networks across multiple countries, expanding internet access and supporting e-commerce growth. While critics highlight concerns about debt sustainability, labour practices, and transparency, many African governments view China as a willing partner in financing projects that Western institutions have historically been reluctant to support. Moreover, Chinese companies are increasingly hiring local workers, transferring technology, and implementing training programs, building long-term capacity and skills within African economies. As the competition for influence in Africa intensifies, China's focus on infrastructure, industrialization, and mutual economic benefits positions it as a key partner in driving development across the continent. In stark contrast, France's centuries-long involvement in Africa is intertwined with exploitation, suppression, and deeply entrenched power imbalances. The Colonial project, justified under the guise of a racist, civilizing mission, wreaked havoc on African societies and economies, leaving behind legacies of poverty, conflict, and repression. Despite formal independence, neocolonial structures like the CFA franc system, exploitative trade practices, and military agreements continue to constrain African nations' autonomy. These systems maintain a level of dependency that fuels discontent and resistance across the continent. Today, civil society movements, Pan-African organisations, and progressive leaders are mobilising to dismantle the remnants of colonial control and demand more equitable partnerships. They are calling for an end to economic systems that serve foreign interests, military interventions disguised as peacekeeping, and cultural narratives that undermine African identity and agency. This growing resistance reflects a broader desire for African states to assert their sovereignty and shape their futures on their own terms. The shifting global landscape, with emerging powers like China, Turkey, Russia, and the United States competing for influence, offers African nations new opportunities to redefine their relationships and pursue a more autonomous path. Achieving true liberation from the vestiges of colonialism will require breaking free from the economic, military, and cultural ties that continue to limit Africa's potential for equitable and self-directed development. The momentum for change is building, and the possibilities for a reimagined future are expanding. If you loved this video, be sure to like and subscribe.